If you're enjoying haunted UK fiction, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or Ko-fi. Simply search for Haunted UK Podcast. She lowered her voice, almost to a whisper, and glanced to and fro as if cautious of her surroundings. "I think, perhaps, that you might not be able to endure the experience." Initially, I thought that this little put-down of hers was typical of her character. It was both something of a good-natured tease and a defensive stance against what she regarded as my rigid scepticism. It is only now, as I relate these events so many years later, that there was no veiled meaning in those words of hers. It was simply a warning. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to Haunted UK Fiction, a sister podcast to The Haunted UK, which features original flash fiction, short stories, and novellas with paranormal themes. All stories you will hear were written by a collection of talented writers, authors, and storytellers, both independent and professional. In today's episode, we'll be reading the second and final installment of The Mosses by L.D. Brown. L.D. Brown lives in the village of Hawkshead in Cumbria with his wife and too many cats. They own a beer shop together. For the past 7 years, he has been running ghost walks in the village under the name Tallow Tales, the Hawkshead Ghost Walk. Twice weekly, he takes visitors around the village, regaling them with stories of local folklore. This also gives him the opportunity to wear a top hat. In his free time, he writes horror stories and has been fortunate enough to get a few published here and there. He's hoping to get a collection together soon. His fiction is influenced by the bleaker side of the Lake District landscape: rainy, dripping woodlands, mosses, tarns, wetlands, and their sinister ilk. His literary influences include Arthur Machen, M.R. James, E.F. Benson, J.H. Riddle, and Algernon Blackwood. He enjoys folk horror films and Peter Cushing. Get comfortable. Grab a little something to sip on. Perhaps cuddle up under a blanket to help offset the chills coming your way. And let's dive back into the story. I woke later than intended. After ablutions, I descended the stairs to breakfast, admiring the view from the windows as I did so. It was a beautiful day, crisp, clear, and with a sparkling frost that dusted the streets and window ledges lightly. I was ravenously hungry and intended to eat a sizable meal as sustenance for my walk into the mosses. I was hoping to cover a fair amount of ground that day. I was enjoying a final cup of coffee when an accidental glance from the newspaper found the girl standing patiently in the hotel lobby and with a suitcase clasped neatly before her. When she noticed me, she smiled and beckoned. She appeared very bright and cheery. There was no trace of a hangover, of an after-effect marking her eyes or face. She informed me that she was leaving and apologized profusely for not having kept our appointment the evening previous. "That's perfectly all right, but you're leaving so soon." "'Fraid so. James got into a little bother last night and took an early train." "But he's quite well?" I asked casually. The girl hesitated just a little. She was choosing the appropriate words, divulging only what was necessary. "He's quite all right," she said finally. "I don't think the experiment quite agreed with him, but that is what can be expected, I suppose." I told her that I understood and that I would be very sorry to see them leave. But the experiment for Simon and herself? Good results? She smiled and her eyes glazed a little in remembrance, as if the images of the evening could be summoned like projections on a screen. I highly recommend it. I couldn't help but chuckle. Is that right? She lowered her voice, almost to a whisper, and glanced to and fro as if cautious of her surroundings. "I think, perhaps, that you might not be able to endure the experience." Initially, I thought that this little put-down of hers was typical of her character. It was both something of a good-natured tease and a defensive stance against what she regarded as my rigid scepticism. It is only now, as I relate these events so many years later, that there was no veiled meaning in those words of hers. It was simply a warning. I was about to wish her good luck in her future endeavours when a smiling Simon appeared from the corridor carrying a cumbersome portmanteau. We bade each other farewell and shook hands. I was astonished when the girl leaned forwards and gave me a quick peck on the cheek. It was a fleeting moment, and yet I had the distinct impression that her lips were chapped and frightfully cold. I felt embarrassed once again. It was a recurring emotion that holiday, and one that, if memory serves, I'd not felt for many a long year. I stood rooted to the carpet of that hotel lobby and watched the two youngsters make their way through the revolving door. I pondered my imminent wanderings through the forest and discerned a twinge of melancholia. For possibly the first time in my life, I experienced an uncertain dissatisfaction with my self-imposed solitude. On that particular trip, I had caught a brief glimpse of another world that seemed to me rather alluring. All of a sudden, the girl had reappeared. She had completed a full revolution of the door. "If you do give it a go," she called across the lobby, "for goodness sakes, don't..." And with that, she was gone. The middle word was lost, but almost certainly composed of 2 syllables. There were sibilants. Double S, perhaps? No matter. I gathered several supplies and began my trek into the forest. The frost had provided a pleasant crust to the muddy track, which crunched pleasingly under boots. The weak November sunlight was golden and warm. I occupied my mind with all sorts of fancies and sweet imaginings, but frequently it would dwell on that one hidden word. Don't contest it, don't suggest it, don't suppress it. Increasingly, I thought both of my dreams and of the power of the mud. I would certainly not be experimenting with it. It was an absurd idea. Quite a ridiculous notion. The substance would hold no wonder for me, and it was best to put it from my mind. This is what I convinced myself, and yet some unknown force had persuaded me to include an empty glass jar in my knapsack. I hiked through the areas populated with hazel and majestic oak. At regular intervals, left and right stood the mosses. They beckoned. They pulled with some esoteric magnetism, and I was both thrilled and ashamed. The silent, still pools of brown water were both inviting and utterly abhorrent. I attempted, with concerted effort, to admire the trees, to stand resolutely still that I might identify the calls of birds, and yet my eyes were drawn irresistibly down towards those bleak and wild areas. Eventually, I found myself on the same rise that I had encountered the day before, once again overlooking mosses divided by that muddy ridge of turf like a grave. No longer able to resist the urge, and comforting myself by thinking, what's the harm at the end of the day? I descended towards the edge of a large pool of silent water. I removed my boots, rolled up the cuffs of my trousers, and waded slowly and carefully into the depths. The water was breathtakingly cold, and I sunk a little into the soft earth of its bed. It possessed a curious pulling sensation that tugged lightly on the soles of my feet. I discovered a portion of mud, blacker and denser than the rest, and I plunged my jar into the water with a great scooping motion. I extracted a little weed, decanted a little water, and examined the specimen. The jar was filled to the brim with a shimmering, glinting mass, pitch black yet reflective like coal. After securing the lid, I returned to safe dry land. The remainder of that walk was taken hesitantly, somewhat in a distracted frame of mind. Several times I caught myself retracing the paths already taken, as if unconsciously returning back to the town. When I found myself doing this, I sought to push on, to cover yet more ground, to walk on. That entire day was spent wandering to and fro, up and down paths, returning to familiar locations, and sometimes simply standing and staring at pools of water. My mind could find no rest. Beneath the flittering thoughts that came and went, there was an urgent desire to be back at my rooms at the George to investigate the alleged powers of the mud. Weary and sick, I began the long journey back to my accommodation, angry at both my lack of patience and apparently absent self-control. I regretted the collection of the mud. It felt impure. The thought of the jar rattling at the bottom of my knapsack was shameful, as if I was transporting some stolen contraband or had purloined some rare and delicate eggs from an unsupervised nest. However, this feeling of inadequacy soon melted away. It was only a fleeting thing. The sun was still warm and bright. The walk had done me good, and on entering the hotel lobby, I had decided that I would experiment with the mud and that it was a legitimate piece of research. To help me reach this conclusion, I brought to mind all those fascinating historical precedents that the three youngsters had recounted. It was research, after all. I dined that evening quickly and without wine. I didn't wish to dull the preceding experiment through intoxication. To be very honest, I had no appetite. I ate only a little and pushed a tidbit here and there idly across the plate. My mind was feverish with formulating a plan of action, then quickly discarding it, formulating an alternative, re-evaluating, dissecting, pondering. I declined coffee but ordered a glass of brandy to be brought to my room in exactly 10 minutes. At length, I stood before the dressing table on which lay a notebook and a pencil, a towel, the jar of mud, and the glass of brandy. The brandy was to be enjoyed on completion of the experiment, either to combat any adverse effects that I might experience or as solace should the experiment prove unsuccessful. I removed my shoes, jacket, and tie and reclined on the bed, a little chilly in my shirt sleeves. I had brought the towel and the jar of mud to the bedside table so that they might be close at hand. Unscrewing the lid, I dipped my fingertips into the cold substance and administered a little onto my forehead. This done, I lay back with my hands clasped neatly together and resting on my chest, like those figures in Nesbit's tale. The mud began to harden and crack. It tightened and produced an irritating itchiness on which I tried not to dwell. I kept my eyes open and stared directly at a singular point of the ceiling and attempted to empty my mind of all thoughts. A pleasant drowsiness soon occurred. The ceiling was marked by a shaft of light from the outside street lamp. It began to move, imperceptibly at first, and then in gradual increments until there was no doubt of its trajectory, left and right, shortening and lengthening as if that street lamp was swaying in a violent storm. Yet outside the window there was only a deep and profound silence. Evidently the street lamp was rooted to the ground, was quite stationary, and there was no such storm. This bizarre occurrence could only be an hallucination. I didn't go to the window to confirm my suspicions, as I believed it pertinent to stay and experience this strange vision through its natural progression. By now, that shaft of sickly yellow light was moving swiftly to one corner of the ceiling, then to another, then back to its original spot. It paused for perhaps 2 seconds and subsequently whizzed over to a new unexplored corner. Moving, pausing, moving. Eventually, as if that wedge-shaped pool of light was a malleable or liquid mass, it crept down the wall, lingered onto the carpet for a short moment, and finally escaped by sliding under the door. I raised my eyes back to the ceiling and saw that it had been replaced with thousands upon thousands of trees. I was gazing down upon them from high in the air. I appeared to be gliding in cool summer skies. Between this lush greenery, looking at this dizzying height like a vivid and painted scene, lay the mosses, shimmering ever so slightly. But here and there were small, simple dwellings, wooden huts topped with sweeping cones of thatch, dappled with the texture of the hotel room ceiling. I could look within these habitations while still viewing the lay of the land like a bird. Fierce-eyed women, clad in furs and wools, sprinkled dust into crackling aromatic fires, a strange dust that was kept safe in leather pouches hanging from their necks. Flames of magenta and emerald rose to meet me, burning with a refreshingly cool heat. Onwards I flew, far away from the bleating of sheep and the distant sound of felled timber. I was accompanied by my two friendly flames. I moved, with the greatest of care, the bedside table so that the trapped trees behind could flourish freely. Parting the thick curtain of vegetation with the palms of my hands, I might regard the 1,000-strong 20th Legion erecting great towers of grey stone. When the final brick was secured, a great mass of black ooze erupted from the earth and cascaded over us all. I bathed in its warmth and outstretched myself on the carpet so that it might cover every inch of my skin. I crawled through the brush and bracken until I came at great length to my jar of mud, sitting so patiently either on a mound of moss or on the edge of the bed. Liberally, I applied another quantity to the forehead, being certain to clean my hands on the towel before floating once again high above the trees. Only when reaching a certain height did I notice that the trees had somehow grown in vast patterns, as if by some divine hand. The trees spread outwards in gigantic coils and spirals with the diameter of many, many miles. I descended to the center of one particular spiral to dance alone amongst the branches. Great vibrations of color wafted over me like haze. Blues so blue that they were red, and reds so red that they were black, but shimmering like the mud poured into sweet brandy and stirred with a birch twig. Greedily, I supped down my portion in one draught and saw that I stood upon a gigantic sea of glass that stretched for as far as the eye could see, glass that seemingly hovered several yards above the mosses. There were no longer any trees. The mosses simply stretched onwards, bleak and desolate below this clear platform, as if entombed, caged. Looking left and right, I saw no clear landmark nor monument, just glass stretching like an immovable ocean. The sheer flatness was broken by huge copper pipes that crisscrossed the smooth plain and terminated into a network of gigantic drum-like machines that hummed incessantly and belched out great portions of mist at frequent intervals. I had to remove myself from this place. Somehow I had to return to the mud, to the damp and heavenly earth where I might fill my nostrils with the perfumes of nature. And now, the corner of the bedroom. Caressing the wardrobe and regarding the intricate wood grain closely, I began one last time to levitate. The trees had returned and grew in great splendor. The mosses, however, had altered spectacularly. Between the pools of dark water rose structures of stone, pyramids engraved with large spirals and hieroglyphics. There was an air of something both profound and profane emanating from these spaces. I had a distinct, unshakable feeling that these constructions were a form of temple, a place of ancient worship, and yet, despite possessing this quality of antiquity, it was impossible to know whether I was viewing the past or the future. A dull bell sounded, a dreary, unmusical sound, and figures began to pour forth from the many doorways and arches. Black figures, human in form at first glance, but certainly not flesh and blood, crawled down the stone steps and out into the surrounding woodland. They squirmed on all fours, heads shuddered and snapped with demonic intensity, prints of black mud left in their wake. Against my will, it seemed, I hovered very close to one such being and could identify no real characteristics or countenance in that mass of black ooze other than a pair of glowing yellow eyes. I screamed and found myself before my notebook with pencil in hand. I scribbled down all I could recall, and then nothing. I awoke on the floor, lying prostrate between the bed and the wardrobe in a state of undress. With a certain relief, I saw that it was early, around 7:30. The sun was yet to rise, and only a little pale grey light filtered into the room at the curtain's edge. I felt remarkably well. Very well, in fact. But recalling my vision from the night before, I subjected the room to a hasty investigation. It was all in one piece. The bedside table was on its side, and there was a single muddy handprint on the pillow. But these were the only concrete pieces of evidence concerning my weird adventures. I straightened the room, took an invigorating bath and descended for breakfast. I ate well. I took great pleasure in ordering a staggering amount of food and took further delight in witnessing the bemused and incredulous expressions on the collective faces of the serving staff. Porridge with brown sugar, 2 kippers, Earl Grey, poached eggs with bacon, orange juice, black coffee, scones with jam and cream. I ate leisurely and had a great many newspapers spread out upon the table. I was curiously at peace. I neither regretted the events from the evening before, nor was I particularly complacent. Rather, I felt that these unusual urges had been worked out of my system, and was very much encouraged by the fact that events did not exceed my control. All in all, a successful experiment. I decided not to enter the forest that day. Instead, I would stroll through the town, visit the castle gardens perhaps, and browse several bookshops. The day passed pleasantly, although it was one of those singularly dark autumn days that never brighten. The day was permanently gloomy, and the clouds hung oppressively low. The clock struck 4 just as I was leaving a low-ceilinged and black-beamed coffee house. For a brief moment, as I was allowing my eyes to adjust to the light, I noticed that the ancient forest could be seen rising up behind the town hall, blanketing the surrounding hills. On my previous strolls around the town, I hadn't heeded this particular view, and the scene struck me as very dramatic, unnerving. It felt as if the inhabitants of this small town were under the constant supervision and astute surveillance of this venerable landscape, and whatever old gods or forbidden knowledge might be beheld within. Before my very eyes flitted the image of brown leaves dripping with rain, carpets of moss and broom rising and falling to create little hollows where, in times gone by, fairies were said to jig. Following these pictures, my nostrils were assaulted by the stench of rot and mould and decay. I walked. I left the town and descended into the woods. It would soon be dark, and yet this thought did not distract me from the mysterious mission on which I was embarking. The urge for experience and knowledge gripped me. The fact that I held no means of illumination did nothing to depress the spirits. Thin, wet branches and twigs brushed my face as I left the trodden path and pushed into thick woodland where no feet had tread. At periods, brambles slashed at my ankles and tore trouser cuffs. I had not dressed accordingly. My shoes were soon caked in mud, my jacket sodden. Water began to seep into my shirt, chilling me instantly. A chill that penetrated the very bones. As twilight closed in, the surrounding tree trunks lost their colour, lost their definition, and merged with the rising earth. I came at long last to a clearing, a great moss made up of 3 distinct and separate pools of water. A small peninsula jutted into the foremost pool. It was for this that I headed. I was soon up to my stomach on the damp grass, gazing down into the black water, my face a mere few inches from the surface. It was only when recounting these experiences after the space of many a year that I am filled with horror at the inexplicable nature of my actions and my sheer recklessness. It would have now, most certainly, been impossible to retrace my steps and find my way back to my accommodation. Yet, I only had thoughts for the mud. Gently, I dipped my cupped hands into the water and began to drink delicately, as if savouring sweet communion wine. Both arms slipped into the pool, almost to the elbows, and I regarded my hands, pale and huge, grasping and playing with the mud. These hands of mine would lift great globules of ooze, squeeze out the water, and let the whole mess fall again into the pool with a satisfying slap. The ripples cleared, and the surface became smooth and calm once more. Even in the gathering dusk, my reflection was exceedingly lucid. I gazed at my likeness for a long, long time before I realized that this mirror image had its eyes closed. I lowered my face even closer to the water's surface in order to investigate further. It would have appeared that by disturbing the mud, I had inadvertently uncovered a corpse. Only the face could be seen. The back of the head was still very much embedded in the silt and muck. The ears of the man stood out, strikingly phosphorescent from the pool's bed. The deceased man was uncannily similar to myself. The one difference, however, was that he was markedly unshaven. His stubble was quite pronounced, displaying a carelessness to his appearance. Of course, the ghastly fact of the matter dawned on me that the skin had withered, giving the man only the illusion of hair growth. His cheeks were hollow, and the flesh yellowed like the pages of an old book. The hair was ashen grey at the temples, and even under water appeared brittle. I was under the distinct impression that I was gazing at myself, a double, but a double aged by, at the very least, a decade. With sickness and disgust, I realized that I had drunk much water from this well of death. The eyes of the corpse opened slowly. They looked like two pebbles that had been pushed deep into the skull. They were most certainly unseeing, for they were yellow and opaque, like solid pieces of putrescence. The lids seemed too tight, the eyes too big. They bulged outwards monstrously from raw, swollen sockets. When they opened, the lids scraped. While engaged in examining these abhorrent eyes, I was gripped very suddenly and tightly by the upper arms. It was a fierce, cold grip, an iron vice, shackles of ice. Surreptitiously, the corpse had moved. I could not. The mouth of this lich fell open, sickeningly to reveal a toothless and gummy maw. A black froth began to gurgle and rise from the unspeakable thing's gullet, and a drowning, water-clogged wail filled the darkness. That is all I can recall from that particular night. I'm eternally grateful for both the conscientious gamekeeper that discovered my delirious self and for the purest good fortune that the moss that I had sought out that faithful evening happened to adjoin a neighbouring estate. I cannot remember if it was early morning or later the same night when I was discovered. I suppose it is inconsequential now. The preceding days are somewhat lost within a dream, lying on stiff sheets in a local sanatorium. I drifted through many layers of consciousness. All I can state with any real authority, however, was that I had been discovered half dead. Half dead, half drowned, freezing cold, with a face caked in mud and a head lolling senselessly about in a pool of black water. After a short recovery, I was soon discharged and able to embark on the journey home. I have never since returned to the mosses. Several years after these events, I did discover in some archaeological pamphlet or other that the remains of early picked men, preserved miraculously in the peat, had been unearthed in the mosses, though strangely, not in the location where I was found delirious and near death, but a few miles east. It had been a remarkable discovery. Evidently, the unspeakable thing that I had witnessed, I shudder now as I think upon it, was nothing more than an hallucination. I still enjoy walking, but now I appreciate a wholly different landscape. I partake of many a coastal walk. I favour these topographies of wide open spaces, soft rolling hills and views of the sea. The South Downs has become a firm favourite of mine. I can also spend many an enjoyable afternoon strolling upon long, deserted beaches. Yes, I still prefer my own company. Woodlands and forests, however, I have begun to regard with great distaste. I find that they evoke a claustrophobic sensation, and I have since rejected them outright. This sometimes leads me to lengthen my hikes, frequently finding cumbersome and laborious detours should I find myself confronting a thick patch of trees. Despite my best efforts of relaxation, I regularly awake with a start in the depths of the night, drenched in perspiration, blood throbbing at the temples. I will have awoken from some scene of utter terror and torment. But pondering these scenes, it would appear that I have dreamt of nothing more than water and trees, and mud. That brings us to the end of this episode, and the end of this brilliant story by L.D. Brown. If you would like to hear more from L.D. Brown, you can find his story The Overcoat in Season 1 of Haunted UK Fiction. He's also hoping to get a collection of his short fiction published in the very near future, and has written a short horror novella which he has been sending to publishers. L.D. Brown's social media and contact information can be found in the show's notes. If you have an original story that would send a chill down our spines and you would like to submit it for review, simply send it to hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. That's hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. Until next time, stay safe and take care.